Welcome to the Brain Development Podcast. We're here to show parents there is a pathway to healing the behavioural and learning symptoms of their autistic, dyslexic, ADHD, OCD, Asperger's, dyspraxic and dysgraphic child. And my purpose is to empower parents to understand how they can build their child's brain from the bottom up to invoke change. And today we have Sean McNicholas. He is an ADHD therapist, specialising in supporting teenagers and adults with attention deficit related challenges, emotional regulation difficulties, and executive functioning differences. And his work focuses on understanding ADHD beyond surface level behaviors. He explores the underlying neurological, emotional, and environmental factors that shape how individuals think, feel, and function in everyday life. And he brings a compassionate, strengths-based perspective to ADHD, helping clients and families move away from the shame and frustration towards clarity, self-understanding, and practical change. He has deep, and this is where we got to know each other, interest in neurodevelopment, emotional well-being, and lived experience. And he's passionate about reframing ADHD, not as a deficit, but as a different way of processing and engaging with the world. And he bridges clinical insight with empathy, making complex concepts accessible and meaningful for the people he works with. And today, we're going to be talking about managing adult ADHD by supporting the brain and not fighting it. Welcome, Sean. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
So tell me a bit about yourself. How did you end up becoming an ADHD therapist?
Okay. So my life was very chaotic and dysfunctional from a very young age. And I ticked all those boxes in terms of can't sit still, is restless, poor function of concentration and focus, all the way through my school years, the naughty kid, the bad kid, because ADHD, the term never even existed. I was in trouble at school, I was in trouble with the police as a teenager, then I went into those kind of typical behaviours of stimulating myself, sedating myself, whether it was smoking, drinking, taking drugs, just the typical ADHD scenarios I hear every day now with teenagers about trying to co-regulate our brain, trying to calm ourselves down or to activate ourselves in some way. My first job was actually as a nursery teacher. I love working with children. I was a youth worker part-time. I worked as a nursery teacher and I loved working with kids and understanding the psychology behind it. That's when I first discovered about Freud. But unfortunately, nursery work never paid you a lot of money. So I was actively working at weekends, promoting nightclubs, working again in that kind of chaotic environment, light, stimulation, people. It was all going on for me. Just my creative juices were flowing. I did that for about 20 years. And I kind of, through those years, was trying to navigate my life, making poor choices, bad mistakes, issues with relationships, with work, with money, all the typical things you hear with ADHD symptoms now with adults. You're 5 times more likely to be addicted to substances or behaviours. You're 5 times more likely to have suicidal ideation. There's loads of factors that come along with this. And I went through that journey myself until I got to my 40s, where I was so dysfunctional in my life. I just said, I can't do this anymore. I need to do something different. I need to learn what's going on. So I went on this kind of discovery of self-help and personal development to really learn about myself, who I was and why I kept doing the same things, because I kept asking myself the wrong question. I kept saying, what's wrong with me? Why do I keep doing the same things over and over again? And the question should have been, what happened to me? What happened to me to make me feel, think and behave the way I did? So that was my journey. And the more I went into this and the more I went into kind of therapy work for myself, I learned about the brain and about psychology and about how we can change the way we think and feel. And on that journey, I decided to move from working in corporate into going into psychotherapy myself. So I studied and trained and really got into the inner depths of understanding what psychotherapy was and working with trauma, depression, anxiety, addictions, and all the things that come along with that. And during this time, I've got 2 sons. And the typical story again, especially my youngest son, he's acting out of school, he's misbehaving. And the head of year said he needs to be assessed for ADHD. Now, I heard what ADHD was, but I didn't know what it was in detail. And once I went into that discovery of what ADHD was like, I was like, oh my God, this has been my life. Chaos, dysfunction, emotional dysregulation, just the impulsive behaviours, hyperactivity, risk-taking, thrill-seeking, and so on. And that was it. That was my dive in then, because then I realised I've got ADHD. My ADHD brain wants to know as much as possible. So I dived in to learn more, study more, so I could support my son. And part of my training was I studied with the likes of Dr. Russell Barkley. He was called the godfather of ADHD. And he says, one thing you need to do is learn more than the doctors and teachers, because they don't know what they're talking about. And that's no disrespect to them, but it's so much more deeper and more complex than they think. So I studied and trained to become a clinical ADHD therapist. And then along the way became a brain health professional with Dr. Daniel Lehman. Then I found out about Dr. Melillo. So I studied his course. In between that, I was studying functional neuroanatomy in Cambridge University to learn more about the brain and the function of the brain, so I could learn everything about it. And what's really interesting on my journey was I always thought it was kind of a psychological issue with ADHD, but as we both know now, there's a functional issue deeper inside in terms of the layers of the brain and development and so on. And then here we are. I work every day. My practice is working with people with ADHD. And by the way, we all know that it's not just ADHD. Everyone has a bit of neurospiciness in some way. They have a bit of autism, a bit of dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, the OCDs, the tics, the stims. We know there's a bit of everything, because I am mixed. So when someone says they have ADHD, I've never met one client, and I've had hundreds and hundreds, who just has ADHD. They have a mix of many, many things. And this is why, going back to Dr. Melillo, we talk about functional disconnection, about the brain's imbalanced in some way. And this is what I like to work on. So I work on a psychotherapeutic perspective, but with the work we're doing ourselves, we're trying to get deeper into the functional part of learning about ADHD. And going back again in sense of working with adults with ADHD, again, the story was years ago, ADHD was a child development issue. You would grow out of it, as what many doctors used to say. But guess what? I've got clients in their 60s and 70s who still have challenges with ADHD behaviours. So this thing is not going away, and we need to work with it in a much more kind of 360 approach.
So what does supporting the brain rather than fighting it actually mean in practice for someone living with adult ADHD?
For me, what I've learned is that with ADHD, it can be quite sporadic. It can be high and low. It's up and down like this all the time. And what I've learned is that we need calmness. We need homeostasis. We need to calm the brain down and slow the brain down. Give ourselves some space and time to think more clearly. Otherwise, we're very impulsive and reactive. So for me, when I look at the 360 approach on that kind of first session, I want to do a deep dive into your lifestyle choices, your behaviours. I want to know how well you're sleeping. I want to know about your diet, your nutrition. I want to know about exercise and movement. I want to know what kind of work and stresses you have, whether you're working or studying. There's many things that I want to dive into to understand what are the other layers that come over this, because as the sort of comorbidities, coexisting conditions, you'll find out that people have got anxieties and traumas and depressions, and we have to unpick all this stuff, because by the time they come into adulthood, they've carried so much stuff because of their experiences living with ADHD. It's been very tough. And like you said before, we talk about the guilt and shame. We talk about the embarrassment. We talk about the social anxieties. We talk about, some like to withdraw, some approach too much. So we really need to dive into all aspects of that.
So in clinic, when you're seeing ADHD, adult patients, what happens neurologically for that ADHD patient that's constantly pushing against their limits instead of working with them? How are you working with them on that?
Well, we work on stressors. We work on co-regulation. We work on what's going on in their environment. We work on, where are their challenges? Procrastination is one of them, an avoidance strategy from the fear of a negative consequence or outcome. There's always reasons why I'm looking at behaviours. Like, why are you doing this? Why are you thinking like this? Where is this catastrophic thinking coming from? We really need to unpick I'm listening all the time to the words they're using. It could be quite general and broad in what they say. It could be quite distorted in what they say. Is it true? Is it real? How do you know? Have you ever tested it? We challenge the thinking. And this is why it's important to me to work from teenagers upwards, because one of the techniques I use is CBT. And you can't use CBT on young kids because the brain's still not developed. The cognitive part of the brain is still developing through those teenage years. So it's about getting people to see things differently and to understand how their brain functions. And what I love about the work I do now I can explain to them why they do the things they do. Where is this rejection sensitivity coming from? Where is this injustice sensitivity come from? Where is this guilt sensitivity coming from? Because there are, as you know, we talk about the Moro reflex and the fear paralysis. There's something deep rooted sometimes for these people.
Yeah. I know I'm sitting here thinking, I think I need a session with you.
Every time I do a podcast, it ends up becoming a mini session. People saying, "Oh, I do that. I think like that."
I know. I'm just sitting here thinking, my God, it's like self-destruction. You're doing things for a reason, and it becomes self-destruction. So, I really try and work on nervous stim regulation. How do you do it? Because what part of the process do you start working on nervous system once you've gone through the emotional piece?
Well, I mean, one of the things I do, I work on your daily routine. I want to know from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, I want to know what you're doing. I want to know what you're eating. I want to know what you're drinking. I want to know what you're watching, reading, listening to. We look at everything. There's people that, wake up first thing in the morning, and I've got a client that has 4 double espressos in the morning, right? 4 double espressos. Got people that, they're vaping first thing in the morning. We talk about the stimulants and behaviours, because look at me, I'm looking at stimulants like, why do you need 4 espressos in the morning? And they look at me and go, I don't know. And it's a story they tell themselves. I need a coffee to wake up. And I said, what kind of person needs to wake up in the morning? Someone who's had a bad sleep. And I say to them, the secret to a good morning routine is a good bedtime routine. And we just go through the day. People say I can't sleep at night time, but I'm on my phone till 12 o'clock at night, and then I'm on Netflix watching horror movies, and I'm watching police shows, and they're switching their brain off. And they said I can't sleep. I said I wonder why. You're stimulating your brain with these devices. You might like clients have a coffee at 8 o'clock in the evening and they can't sleep. Or they go onto the ADHD meds as well, and they misuse those. Or you've got the people that stimulate during the day, and then they're sedating in the evenings. They might be drinking alcohol, they might be smoking weed, and they're doing it to wind out. And I say, what kind of person needs to wind down? Someone who's stressed out. Why are you stressed out? We need to unpick all this stuff. So we break it down, and we find moments in the day where you find some stress, some space and time in your day to unpack and just process thoughts, because so many people are busy all day long. They never stop. They never stop until that screen goes off. I know. They never stop till that screen goes off and they switch off, and they expect the brain just to fall asleep. It can't. The brain's just saying, hold up, there's so much stuff that's gone on today. I need to process this. There's so much uncertainty. I was meant to call John back, and I'm meant to prepare myself for a meeting tomorrow. I haven't done none of it. And people talk about insomnia, type 1 and type 2. I don't believe the issue with insomnia is sleeping. The issue with insomnia is thinking. You are having this obsessive thinking because you're unable to switch the brain off, because you're going into that kind of fight or flight. You don't feel safe. You have this anxiety, and the brain is unable to switch off. Unless you're so physically shattered, the brain just crashes, and about 2, 3, 4 in the morning, it jumps up and says, right, you've had some physical rest. Let's get back to work. We need to worry about...
Yeah, that was me at 5 a.m. Yeah.
And then people have this natural feeling of this habit of worrying about worrying. They wake up, and when they're in that kind of default mode of not doing anything, it's like, oh, let me think about what I need to worry about again. And you're not living in the present. You're stuck in the past, or you're worrying about the future. These negative fantasies of what could happen. All of a sudden you become a fortune teller or a mind reader of what you think people are thinking, or how you think someone's going to end up. But it's about being present in that moment. And with ADHD, typically we're very time blind. We live in the now. There's the now and the not now. The amount of times where people make really poor choices because they're in that kind of survival mode activation system, and they don't foresee any consequences or hindsight, because they are living in the moment. They can't think about anything else because they're so activated. And again, I read in research that we consume 5 times more energy in fight or flight, and we're activated a lot in fight or flight with ADHD. It's about calming that nervous system down. Yeah. And for me, I have these kind of, from my day, for example, my routine, I have at least 2 half-hour breaks from my day. I need to put the phone down. I need to go for a walk. I need to leave my, just leave everything behind and just process my thoughts, just disconnect from the screens. We all live in boxes. We move in boxes. We eat from boxes. We need to connect back with nature, and we need to find that space and time to process and reflect. So by the time we get to bed, there's nothing more to unpack. There's nothing else to think about.
I can very much relate to that, because I think once you're a very driven, kind of left brain, strong person, and you know what you can achieve, you just try and achieve more and more and more and more, and there is no stop. And that is bad, because at some point you are going to just collapse. Literally, those frontal lobes, and I told you just now, those frontal lobes just can't do anymore. They are tired, and they are really to a point of exhaustion. And it's because I just don't stop. And there is no break.
And the question is why, right? The question is why. Why do we want more? Why do we want more? Because we want to feel as if we're more. The reason why we want to feel as if we're more is because on the inside we believe we're less in some way. We have these negative beliefs of feeling like we're not good enough, we're not worthy, we're not capable, we're not smart as some people, or popular, or successful. So we're driven by this toxic fuel to go, to feel like we're the same as other people.
Yeah, I think what's worse is not the comparing. I don't do a lot of comparing to other people, but there is a lot of information out there now, and how you take in that information.
But why are you driven? Why do you keep going?
To achieve. Okay, look, we just turned into a therapy session. This is amazing. So yeah, it's down to achievement, and I think I mean I know why I'm the way I am, because as a kid I used to come home with B's and C, well, mostly C's. So I was never that A B kid, and so I always would bring my grades home, and I'd say to my mum, "Oh, I got a C plus," and she'd be like, "That's good." And then I'd come home with the very, infrequent A minus, and she'd say, "That's good." So there was literally no additional feedback. There was no, "Wow, you did really well." So I just keep going and going and going. And I thought I've unpacked that before, but obviously I haven't. And
but what are you seeking? You're seeking validation. You're seeking significance.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It's a shocking. Oh, it's shocking how you push yourself to such a limit, and it's like self-sabotage, but not really, because you're enjoying the ride until you collapse. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sometimes we enjoy the ride, and when we get to the summit, we're not even overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, I know.
It's the chase, but when we talk about the chase, it's the seeking. That's the dopamine. The dopamine is the seeking and the chase of something. Of course, there's a reward at the end if you're happy with it, but we get the dopamine from chasing. Something new, exciting, innovative, creative, or scary, or fearful, or dangerous. Our dopamine system just kicks in.
Yeah. So I'm not the fearful. I'm not the dangerous. I'm not that side. I don't go to that extreme to get that dopamine kick. I just push myself to an extreme, which is not good.
I know, but you're pushing yourself from a negative place because you're seeking the achievement and success. So you're coming from a place of fear because you don't want to be that failed. Like, we talk about fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of not being good enough, fear of the unknown, fear of not being in control. There's always the fears that drive us to push us for those motivations.
So how do you end up ensuring those patients of yours start changing? So do you help them set a really clear structure for their day so that they can do that unwinding? What do you do?
Yeah, every case is unique because everyone's coming with different issues, So, and people will say to me, again, I've never met anyone with ADHD who has not got an issue with either trauma, addictions, relationship issues. There's many things that come with it. It's very interwoven. For me, as you know, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition. For me, which means at some stage, for some reason, the brain had not developed as nature intended. And it's very easy for some people to say it's just genetic, which means we can't do nothing about it, get diagnosed and get medicated. But for me, people have gone through something, whether it's some form of abuse or any type of neglect, and that could be chemical, physical, or psychological. It could be in the womb, it could be epigenetics, but there could be other factors that happened once you were born into the world, and social environmental factors. So I have to address each case as it comes in and look at what is it they're looking for. I ask a very simple question sometimes, and it stumps them. I say to them, "What do you want?" And they look up in the air for minutes and they went, "I don't know." So that's a sign they're stuck. They don't know what to do, but they don't know what to do because they don't know who they are, and very much so again with ADHD, we are chameleons. We've learned to adapt to our environment to please people. We just want to feel safe and wanted and accepted and so on. So all of a sudden we move away from our authenticity to feel connected, to feel safe, to feel loved. So we have to really deal with each case in isolation. But like I said, some of the steps are just to dive into what's going on in your life right now. Let's see if we can, the moment I say to people, and again, I hear you say time and time again, especially with Vicky as well, let's just do a 2-week abstinence of no gluten, no dairy. Let's see what happens, or I say to them, let's think about focusing on your sleep routine. Let's focus in on just switching off your device at 9 o'clock rather than 12 o'clock. Let's focus on these small little tweaks and see what happens. And it's amazing when they trust the process. And for me, it's about trust, because if they trust me, we will get better results. With ADHDs as well, some of them don't like being told what to do. There's this ODD, opposition defiance disorder, right, for some people, or PDA. So they want to do it their way, but they learn over time. Like I've got a client that's been with me for over a year now, and only now is kicking in the things that we spoke about a year ago. He said, because he's fell off the wagon a few times. He said, look, I need to trust you, and I need to follow your process. And then by doing so, we slowly peel away all the layers of the difficulties and the challenges. The brain starts to calm down. For me, I've got so much order in my life now: planning, organisation, structure, routine, all things that never existed. And by doing so, by knowing what I'm doing every minute of every day, by having planning and organisation and consistency, and more importantly, certainty, that calms my nervous system down, because there's no fear.
Yeah, I think it definitely is a whole nervous system approach. And, I've been doing recently, because I've needed it, a lot more vagal kind of stimulation. I've got my pulse setter, just to help me kind of calm. Did my breathing this morning with, I use one on YouTube. There's a guy called Sandy that's really good, and I really like him. I sat in front of my red light and just did that this morning. And it really does help. Breathing really helps. And you kind of go, whatever. Yeah. 10 minutes of breathing a day, but it really helps. And then in the car on the way back, I put it on again, did my breathing in the car. It just really helps to just calm that nervous system down. And it's the regular consistency piece that I talk to all of my patients about in doing those exercises with their children. Yeah, I've had to start putting that in place, because otherwise my nervous system is just on overdrive, and then you just become even more depleted, and you can't do the exercise. And I love my exercise, because you just can't get to do it. Like, you just don't want to, because you're just exhausted.
And I know you've done a podcast before about nose breathing. Again, and it's very common. I'm a mouth breather, so I have to work very hard to practice nose breathing. And there's a correlation between mouth breathers and ADHD again. So we talk about nitric acid coming to the brain. We talk about oxygenation and energy and so on. So again, there's another connection. So I showed you my post-it on the side of my screen earlier saying slow down, but the other one is nose breathe.
Really? Yeah.
So I'll have to remind myself all the time to practice this myself.
Yeah. The one slow down, I need one of those. I'm going to put one on my side of my desk just to slow down, because I feel that you can achieve such a hell of a lot in a day. And because I've achieved a hell of a lot in a day, I'm like, wow, how many more days can I push that? And you then get to a point where weeks fly by and you're just pushing and pushing, and you're like, God, you're achieving so much. And then you kind of go, I'm actually getting to a point of breakdown. Those frontal lobes are just going into a state of stress so much that I'm now going to give myself last week, I just couldn't talk. By about Friday, I just couldn't talk.
But this is why balance is so important for us. And this is why one of the systems I share with my clients is that I use an old school diary. And the reason why I use an old school diary is that because with ADHD, if we don't see it, it doesn't exist. And this is why some of us are so messy that things are hanging on door handles, on door edges, on the back of a chair. It's because we need to see stuff. And some teenagers in their bedrooms, it looks like a real mess, but for them it's organised. It's organised chaos. And even when they see their jeans on the floor, for them, they want to lie it down because they don't want to put it on a chair because it might crease up. This is why we call it a floor drope. So there is a logic behind what we do. But with my diary, I know there's 24 hours in a day. I know 8 of those hours are sleeping. So with the other 16 hours, I have to schedule my day and I have to put everything in there. I have to put in if I'm going to the supermarket, if I need to go to the dentist, if I'm going for a break, if I'm going for a school run, all my clients. I need to put them in there, but also factor in if I'm going to the dentist, when do I have to leave? Because I forget this stuff because with ADHD, we just put dentist 10 o'clock and we leave at 10 o'clock and then guess what? We're late. And then we kick ourselves for being late. Oh, you idiot. And all the self-talk comes in as well. But by following the diary and planning your day with everything from morning to night, it's like a sat nav, right? You put in a destination, you follow the step-by-step instructions and you reach your goal. And by doing so, you don't overlook anything and you don't go beyond your capacity, because burnout and overwhelm is very common for us because we try to squeeze too many things in. And the reason why we do that is because they don't use diaries, they use a to-do list. And they've got a to-do list, and without context, it's like, how much time do I need? When do I need to do it by? Exactly. How much time do I need to do this task? And we normally underestimate it. Then when do I need to do it by? How important or urgent is it? And we need to use these systems to then get it out of our head and put it down. So I just look to my right, what am I doing next? What am I doing next? I don't need to think about anything. It's down all the time. Because the to-do list, it never ends, And when it gets too long and overwhelming, you just start a new one. I call it a wish list, right? These are things that you wish to do that you hardly ever achieve. So by having order and organisation and structure and routine in your day by using a diary, you know that you can't be in two places at the same time doing two different things. You can't do it. So the diary visually shows you that. And when I used to use a diary and calendar on my phone or on my PC, for example, the moment that window was closed, I forgot about it. It was gone. If you don't see it, it doesn't exist. And it'd be out of my mind. So physically it's there. I've got a big whiteboard there. I'm writing stuff down all the time, just notes, and then put it into my diary, schedule it in. And for me, that system really works. It works really well for clients. And it just said, I just feel much more organised. I'm waking up knowing what I'm doing. I feel like I've got more time than I thought. I'm giving myself some breaks because having those breaks is really important, and that detox of digitals, right? We need to switch off.
I wanted to talk about that because the breaks I don't schedule in, right? I just work all day and every single hour is full and there is no break. I don't even have a break for lunch. That's it. That's how I'm being at the moment. But the tech, I find it.
How's that going for you?
It's not going well. That's what I said when I got on the call. I looked like I was about to pass out. But the tech, I find the tech overwhelming. I can't do Instagram. I've had to ask somebody, my sister's helping me with my own Instagram on brain development. I just can't do it. And even I don't check. Maybe I scroll like 2 scrolls and then it's so overwhelming that I turn it off. I can't even check it. And I find emails is just hundreds every day. I find the whole thing too much some days. Other days I can cope with it. But tech is this is why we've all got ADHD. I'm sure of it, because we're just so fast now. Everything is so fast. And then the level of expectation, like when you used to phone somebody up for an appointment, you probably wouldn't expect them to come back to you within, a few days. Now it's like expected within an hour. And there's like this.
Yeah, but the question is, why are you reactive? Like, again, I schedule times in my... Yeah, so I schedule times in my day to check my emails and check my messages so people know there's certain days of times in the day that they won't get response. Or with my friends, normally, they know socially I'm not available to the weekends. I work all day talking to people. The last thing I want to do in the evenings is talk to people. I want to rest. So I may have a message now and again, but for me, again, structure and routine, and again, that's scheduled into my diary. Otherwise we become very reactive and very responsive, and then that activates us. It does. And then we send something, and then we keep checking to see if we've got a response. And again, it causes anxiety for people.
So talk to me about teenagers and how you help them, because they're at quite a defiant age with all those hormones flying around. How do you show them those ways of operating for them to take that on and help their day? Because, you can tell them, but it's more around how do you get them to adapt? Do you just get them to adapt to few things slowly and then over time, then add more in?
I'm a believer that the responsibility is with the parents.
Yeah.
I believe the moment you give your child autonomy, that's going to cause problems. I've seen households where the teenager is the dominant force in the house. What they say go, no one can tell them what to do, and that's once you go down that road, it's very, very difficult. I've never found a family where at least one parent is not neurodivergent, whether they know it or not. So what will happen is sometimes they book in and they give me this whole profile of their son, and they put the son on the call and say, fix him. And for me, it's like, whoa. I want to speak to you guys first. I want to know what's going on. I want to know about the family dynamic. I want to know how he's living. I want some background on everything to do with the household. Because there's so many factors, and as a parent, our role, first of all, from when the baby's born, is to co-regulate, right? We're meant to calm the baby down, calm down the nervous system so they feel calm and relaxed. Now, if you have a dysregulated child or teenager, but the parent is dysregulated, how can you co-regulate that child? So first of all, and this is a journey I had to go on. I had to sort my own shit out first, because otherwise you bring it into the household and then you're just triggering each other. And I see it so many times with families that the parents are triggering the kids and vice versa. Second of all, what is really struggling is that parents are stressed out. They're overwhelmed. They're working too hard. There could be issues with relationships, with money, with addictions, single parent families. There are so many factors. Could have 4 or 5 kids, who have their own challenges. There are so many factors to consider as to why this household is the way it is. What I find is with teenagers, it's really sad. I had a 14-year-old boy last week, all the way through the call. He's not in school. He is vaping, and again, we talk about digital devices. Schools and the government have got responsibility to not allow these young people to be addicted to these devices. These kids are vaping. The vapes are designed like sweet shops, right? Colours and flavours, like Alco Pops years ago, to appeal to the younger demographic. And so you're now you're being challenged with the devices, with staying up late, with smoking weed, with the vaping. There are so many challenges. I've got kids that are drinking 3 or 4 Monsters a day. So they're dealing with the caffeine intake, but they're saying to me, I don't want to go on medication. I said, you are on medication. You're medicating yourself in a different way. You're drinking Monsters and smoking weed at night time. And it's really sad. It's so complex. But again, for me, it's about working with the family to understand roles and responsibilities, setting boundaries. They need to make sure that the child understands what no means, but with an explanation, with compassion and understanding. The child needs to know that they cannot have access to their parents all the time, because sometimes the parents have to cook and do laundry and take care of other kids. But the parents need to explain it in a way that the child doesn't feel rejected or abandoned. There's so many things that I see in the household. How are they eating? What are they eating? Is the stress coming from the parents? The child seems to be okay, but there's difficulties in the family. There might be some physical abuse, sexual abuse. All these factors, I'm seeing these all the time, unfortunately. Dysregulating the child, I can see them really highly traumatized. Sometimes the parents are physically there, but emotionally unavailable. And what I mean by that is, they could be, the child wants their mum's attention, but mum's on the phone and she's saying, yeah, and not looking at him, no eye contact. Again, we have this disconnection, and the message the boy's receiving is, she doesn't care about me, I'm not important. This phone seems to be more important, so let me start doing it myself as well. So I see all this stuff, and then going to school, as again, with ADHD and other neurodivergence, sometimes people find it hard to sit still. Some people find it hard to look down and look up, and convergence with the eyes affects brain function. They find it hard to be in environments where they're busy, where they're noisy, sensory stimulation, sensory overload. There's too much going on. They're hearing everything as if it's all important. They're seeing things as if they're all important. There's bullies in the classroom. There's teachers that are not giving them the attention they need. For kids that go to school, there's two things that are really important. They need to enjoy the teacher. The teacher needs to understand who they are, what their needs are, but also they need to enjoy the subject. If they feel disconnected from this teacher, if they're not enjoying the subject, they just tune out. And guess what? They just fall behind. And when it gets to the point where the teacher says, does everyone understand the lesson today? Johnny's never going to say no. He doesn't want to be seen as being stupid. So he starts to act out and starts being the naughty kid. He'd rather be naughty than thick and stupid. And then, they do try and put measures in the schools. Sen have got these hall passes, but as my son called them, the retard card. So no one wants to show the retard card because now you're going to be a retard, because there's a real stigma of neurodivergence in schools. Everyone's mental. So it's such a minefield for these teenagers. So my job is to ground them. My job is to help them understand things in a more logical way, because neurodivergent people have to make sense of what's going on. Everything needs to make logical sense. Otherwise, it makes no sense. So I'm that kind of person where they're asking me, why am I feeling this way? Why do I do these things that I do? What can I do to improve my performance or my ability playing football? I spend a lot of time with parents. I spend just as much time with parents than I do with the children, to be the frontal lobes for that child. I say the child is like the bowling ball going down the lane, and we're the bumpers on the outside to make sure they don't fall off the edge. But we have to do it in a way where we don't feel like we're making them feel like babies. Now, I'll never say to my son, your brain's developing 30% slower, so you're 18 going on 12. I'm never going to say that to him, because it makes him feel inferior again. But I'm mindful of it. I'm mindful of having to support him in such a way.
What strengths come out and emerge when they stop fighting that whole ADHD piece from a situational perspective?
For me, it's explained to them that, first of all, it's not your fault.
Yeah.
This is just the way some people's brains develop, and we all have gifts and we all have challenges. But it's about helping them see what I did with myself in my own kind of R&D on my own brain, was to work with my brain, to understand what type of brain I have, what are my strengths and weaknesses, and to work with it rather than against it. I was trying to make it do things that there was lots of resistance to. So I started to embrace and understand my brain. And as you know as well, sometimes you're working with people, some people are left brain dominant, some people are right brain dominant. So I help them understand in a really simple way how the brain functions, why it functions the way it does, what we can do to support it, and just to make them feel normal, make them feel, I say we're all unique individuals. No two people on the planet are the same, So when you talk about, I don't want to feel different, I don't want to feel stupid, I don't want to feel like an idiot, I feel like something wrong with me, we could say that about everyone. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. And it's about making them believe in themselves and giving them some hope. We need to find out what your strengths are. We need to work on those. We need to develop them. And we need to always just see that there is a choice. Because with that catastrophic thinking, no one can fix me, I'm broken, it's my fault, I'm an idiot, I don't feel loved or significant or validated. So we have to really unpick all that stuff, all these negative, limited beliefs, and let them see themselves for who they are.
Yeah, that's great. And I know, we've got a time that we need to kind of finish at. Last question. So if there's one thing that you'd wish in the world you understood more about adult ADHD, what would it be?
I just wish, I always ask a question to my clients about, when they fill in a form and they've been diagnosed, they say, I've been lately diagnosed. And I ask them, how do you feel about that? And some of them are really angry. They're really angry. I'm angry that I've lived my life. Now I've just found out the reason. Now I've found out, like, these are all the things that happened in my life. And they feel really resentful and bitter about, where they are in their life. Some people have had many, many struggles. For me, it was about understanding and being able to go back in my life and reflect on the things that I've done, the poor choices I made, and reflect back and say, well, okay, now I understand, based on what ADHD is and why we do the things we do, now I understand how these things happened. And I do it with compassion and understanding and love, to free myself from the guilt and shame, to say, that was a poor choice based on your circumstances at that time. You look back now and you would say, I would never do that, not the person I am today. but to look back and understand that I just did not know.
Yeah.
You know, I did not know why I was the way I was. You know, the amount of times where I was in trouble at school or in trouble at home, you know, I'm a bad boy, I'm a naughty kid, and just kept being told, you know, what's wrong with you? You know, or, you know, we need to fix you and stuff like that. And really, now it all makes sense.
And you
That
went
all
through a
makes sense.
process of forgiveness, did you?
Oh, 100%. I went through like about 10 years ago, I went through this process called ego death.
Right.
You know, and I had to really let go of all, because a bit like what you were saying before, you know, I was driven by ambition and significance and success because I came from a place of poverty and inadequacy and feeling weak and inferior and feeling like I wasn't good enough. So I was driven, you know, and I was really working hard. I was making loads of money and I was living the dream, and I was driving Lamborghinis and Ferraris. I was featured in Forbes magazine over there. I was doing everything to say, look at me. I am good enough. I am worthy, but I was chasing it. You know, I wanted all these symbolic things to say, look at me. I'm as good as you. I'm as successful as you. But I realised it was all just nonsense because it was me still driven by this inadequacy inside myself. And the ego death was part of just letting go of everything. I'm just saying, I am happy with who I am. I know who I am. I know why I'm here. And this is my journey.
Love it. That was amazing. What an incredible podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
And if our listeners haven't actually subscribed to my podcast yet, please do push the subscribe button. It really does help me. And if you need to look into Sean further and find out his services, where can they find you, Sean?
You can find me at the ADHDexpert.com or on socials at the ADHD Expert.
Amazing. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.